The radiator in the front room stopped working on a Friday. I know it was a Friday because Fridays were the days Renford used to bring home those little sugared almonds from the Portuguese bakery on the corner, the ones wrapped in tissue paper that left a faint pink stain on your fingers. He did that for 31 years without ever once being asked. Now the bakery is a cell phone shop, and Renford has been gone for 4 years, and the radiator went cold on a Friday like the day itself wanted me to remember him. I stood in front of it in my wool cardigan, his wool cardigan technically, the charcoal one with the moth hole near the second button, and I pressed my palm flat against the metal, the way you'd check a child's forehead for fever. Stone cold. I knew what it meant. It meant calling someone. It meant explaining the ancient system of pipes running beneath this house, the quirks that only Renford and I understood, the valve behind the boiler that needed coaxing before it would cooperate. It meant a stranger walking through these rooms, looking at things with professional eyes that don't see what those things are. I didn't call anyone. I put on 2 more sweaters and sat in the kitchen where the oven throws warmth, and I told myself I'd deal with it Monday. My name is Adeline. I am 86 years old. And I want to tell you something that took me nearly 2 years, a sprained wrist, one very unfortunate incident involving a ladder and a gutter full of wet leaves, and a particular Tuesday afternoon in October to finally understand. I want to tell you before you do what I almost did, before you let someone hand you a brochure, before you let the people who love you most accidentally dismantle the only life you still recognize as your own. Here is what I know about houses. A house is not the sum of its walls. This house, the one I have lived in for 43 years, is the place where my son Crispin learned to walk by gripping the hallway baseboard. It is where I planted the quince tree in the back garden the autumn I turned 50, not knowing then that I would still be here to see it grow taller than the fence. It is where Renford and I argued about money in the kitchen and made up without words in the garden, passing a cup of tea back and forth in the dark. It is where I became who I am, slowly, the way trees become trees. You cannot fold all of that into a suitcase and carry it into somewhere called Tranquil Pines or Heather Ridge and expect the person inside you to survive the move intact. But bodies grow inconvenient. That is the blunt truth no one says plainly enough. My hands, which once could split firewood and roll pastry and type 60 words a minute, began to tremble somewhere around my 83rd year. Not violently, not alarmingly, just persistently, the way a loose window rattles in a certain kind of wind. My left knee, which I injured falling off a bicycle in 1987 and thought I'd fully recovered from, apparently had opinions about staircases that it had been quietly saving for decades. My eyes, which were never particularly reliable, started requiring more light than any lamp I owned seemed capable of producing. None of these things happened all at once. They arrived the way winter does, a slightly earlier sunset each day, not dramatic, not sudden, until one morning you realize the dark comes before supper and you can't quite remember when that started. My daughter-in-law, Priscilla, noticed before I did, or before I was willing to. Priscilla is a thorough woman. She makes lists, she researches things, she approaches problems the way a surveyor approaches land, measuring everything, accounting for every variable, leaving nothing to chance or feeling. She means well. I want to be absolutely clear that she means enormously, devotedly well. She started coming by twice a week instead of once. She reorganized the bathroom cabinet so the things I use most often were at eye level, which was practical, and which also felt like the first small flag planted on the territory of my independence. She left typed notes on the counter with reminders about medications and about not leaving things on the stove. She spoke to Crispin in voices that went quiet when I entered rooms. When I finally asked her directly what was being discussed in my absence, she sat down across from me at this kitchen table, and she said in her careful Priscilla way that the family had been thinking about options. Options. The word arrived like a stone dropped into still water. I watched the ring spread. She had done her research naturally. There was a folder, color-coded tabs, one section for in-home care services, one for what she delicately called transitional living communities, one for a place called Halcyon Court that had won some kind of award for its dementia ward, which I found particularly interesting, given that I do not have dementia and have not, to my knowledge, given anyone reason to think otherwise. I looked at the folder. I looked at Priscilla. I said with as much grace as I could manage that I would think about it. I did not think about it. I thought about everything except it. I thought about the quince tree and whether it would get enough water if no one was here who knew to water it in August. I thought about the bookshelves Renford built, impractically narrow, beautiful in their impracticality, which would look like nothing in someone else's house and everything in mine. I thought about what it means to be a woman who raised a child and managed an office and learned French at 62 and grew vegetables from seed and now was being handed a color-coded folder of options. Crispin came eventually, as I knew he would. He flew in from Edinburgh. He is a kind man, my son, soft in the way that tall men sometimes are, always a little apologetic for taking up space. He sat in Renford's chair. They all sit in Renford's chair now. I've stopped saying anything about it. It's just a chair. And he told me he was worried. He said the word several times. Worried. I heard it each time as a different word. Afraid, guilty, exhausted by the logistics of having an old mother who refuses to be managed. I told him what I had told Priscilla, that I was fine, that the house was manageable, that I had a system. What I did not tell him was that the system had been slowly failing for 18 months, that I had stopped cooking proper meals because standing at the stove for long periods made my knee swell, that I had not been to the shops alone since the autumn when my hands shook on the bus and a stranger had to help me with my coat buttons, which was not painful exactly, but which left me sitting on my own sofa for an hour afterward in a state I could not name. That the radiator had now been cold for 3 weeks, and I had said nothing to anyone. I was protecting something. Not pride exactly, though pride was part of it. I was protecting the version of myself that still existed in these rooms. The self that knew where everything was and why it was there. The self that had opinions about tea and the correct way to prune roses, and which books deserved their reputation and which did not. That self required this house the way a flame requires oxygen. Take away the house, and you don't relocate the flame. You extinguish it. But I was also afraid, which is harder to admit than anything else. I was afraid that I was wrong, that the house was winning. That Priscilla's folder was not an overreaction, but a reasonable response to something real that everyone could see except me. The wrist incident happened in November. I slipped on the back step, reaching for a pot of herbs I keep near the door, caught myself on the railing, wrenched my wrist badly enough to require a bandage, and strong opinions from the doctor about what she called unnecessary risk. Crispin was on the phone within an hour. Priscilla drove down the following morning. The folder reappeared. I agreed to try a carer. Not a live-in arrangement, not anything permanent, just a woman who would come several mornings a week to help with the things the wrist made difficult. Her name was Venetia. She was professional, punctual, and possessed of the particular loud cheerfulness that some people adopt around the elderly, as though our difficulty is with hearing and not with circumstance. She called me Lovely as a punctuation mark. "Good morning, Lovely." "Here we are, Lovely." "That's better, isn't it, Lovely?" I endured it for 6 weeks. I want to be fair. Venetia was competent. She did everything correctly. She helped me bathe without making me feel entirely like an object being processed. She prepared nutritionally appropriate meals. She was never unkind. But she moved things, not carelessly, not maliciously, helpfully, always helpfully. The reading glasses migrated from the windowsill to the side table drawer. The specific cup I use for morning tea, the blue one with the slightly uneven handle that I bought from a potter at a market in 1996, appeared one day on a different shelf. Small adjustments, made in the spirit of order, each one a tiny erasure. When the blue cup moved for the 3rd time, I understood something that I couldn't have explained to Priscilla or to Crispin, without sounding like a woman losing her grip on proportion. The cup mattered not because of what it was, but because of where it lived. Because the location of things in my house is a map of my own history. Moving the cup was not tidying, it was revising. I let Venetia go the following week. Crispin said things that were hard to hear. I heard them anyway and sat with them, and then continued to do what I had decided. What I had decided was simply to endure, to hold the line, to get through winter and see what spring brought. What spring brought was Soren. He arrived in April, I first saw him from the front window, which I often sit near in the mornings because the light is best there. He was across the street, struggling with what appeared to be a vacuum cleaner, 2 large bags of groceries, and a bicycle that was refusing to cooperate with the fence post he was trying to chain it to. He was perhaps 40. He moved with the mild, defeated energy of someone who has too many responsibilities and not quite enough hands. He didn't knock on my door. I knocked on his the following day, when I saw him attempting to read an instruction manual in the rain, while a washing machine sat half installed in his doorway. I brought shortbread because I had made it the night before, and because arriving at a stranger's door without something to offer feels wrong to me in a cellular way. He looked at me as though I were slightly miraculous. He said he had been in the house for 3 weeks and hadn't yet spoken to anyone on the street. I told him I wasn't surprised. I told him the street had grown unsociable and that it wasn't his fault. I told him also that he was installing the washing machine incorrectly and that Renford had installed ours 3 times before getting it right, and that I could tell him exactly where the mistake was if he'd like. I stood in his doorway in my coat and talked him through it from memory. Renford's method, which was probably not the manufacturer's method, but which had worked for 30 years. The machine worked. Soren looked at it running with the expression of a man who has been having a very difficult few months and has just experienced one small, uncomplicated success. He came for tea that Thursday. He had recently moved here from another city after a difficult separation. He had a daughter, Blythe, who was 7, and who came on weekends, and who was, he said with a complicated sort of smile, a tornado wrapped in a person. He was managing, he said. Getting there, I did not tell him I was also managing. That word had started to taste dishonest in my mouth. What happened next happened slowly, which is the only way things that actually work tend to happen. Soren began leaving small things. A bag of groceries on the step with a note, when he'd noticed I hadn't been to the shops. A repaired latch on the garden gate that he'd fixed without mentioning in advance. He sent a message once asking if I knew anything about quince trees, which I found extremely charming since he had clearly looked at my tree and invented a reason to ask. I began leaving things too. A pot of jam, written instructions for the boiler valve, which is genuinely arcane and which I suspected he would need eventually. A book I thought he might find useful, tucked through the letterbox. Blythe arrived one Saturday in May and proceeded to fall in love with the quince tree in the way that 7-year-olds fall in love with things, completely and immediately, and requiring photographs. She asked if she could come back and see it. I said yes. She asked if she could bring her drawing things and sit in the garden. I said yes to that too. She came the following Saturday and sat under the tree for 2 hours, drawing it from multiple angles with a seriousness of artistic purpose that I recognized and admired. I brought her lemonade. She showed me the drawings. She had captured the way the branches go, the particular leaning quality, as though the tree has spent decades listening for something to the east. It was genuinely good. I told her so. Not in the way adults tell children things are good. I told her in the way I would tell anyone whose work had affected me. She came back the next Saturday, and the one after that. Meanwhile, Soren fixed the radiator. He also fixed a section of guttering that had been problematic since 2019. And he did both things with the matter-of-fact practicality of someone who has found a useful way to say thank you and prefers it to words. I fed him dinner twice a week in exchange. Not as a transaction. It began to feel less like exchange and more like the natural rhythm of two households in genuine proximity. Blythe started asking me things. About the tree first, then about the garden generally, then about Renford, whose photograph she noticed on the bookshelf, and asked about directly, in the way only children ask about directly. I told her about Renford. I told her more than I had told anyone in 4 years. She listened with the complete attention of a person for whom stories about other people's lives are not yet ordinary. One afternoon she asked me if I had always lived alone, and I said no, and she said, "Do you get scared at night?" And I paused, because I was deciding how much truth was right for a 7-year-old. And then I said, "Sometimes a little, but not like I used to." And she accepted this with enormous seriousness and said, "I get scared at night too sometimes. Dad lets me keep the landing light on." And I said that was a very sensible arrangement. When Crispin came in June, he found me in the garden with Blythe, who was learning to identify which weeds could be pulled and which plants they needed to work around. He stood at the back door for a moment before I noticed him, and when I turned, his face had an expression I couldn't quite read, something between relief and something older and more complicated. Later, over tea, I heard him on the phone to Priscilla. He said, "She seems different, better. They are neighbors, a man and his daughter." And then a pause while Priscilla responded. And then Crispin said, "I know, I think she has people." I have people. I sat with that phrase for a long time afterward. I rolled it around. I tested it. It was true. Not in the way that Venetia had been a person assigned to me. Not in the way that institutions are full of people. In the way that actually matters, which is mutual, which is chosen, which is about need running in more than one direction. Soren needed someone who knew the neighborhood. Blythe needed somewhere to bring her serious drawings and be taken seriously. I needed what they gave me, without either of us having to name what it was. The wrist healed. The knee remains opinionated. The mornings when the tremor is worse, I sometimes text Soren, who comes and opens whatever needs opening, with a complete lack of ceremony that makes it bearable. He doesn't say, "Of course," or "No trouble," or any of the things that carry pity in their undertow. He just comes and opens things, and usually stays for coffee. I want to say something to you now. If you are the child or the grandchild or the spouse of someone living alone in a house growing too large or too complicated for them, I want to say it plainly because I don't have patience left for anything but plain. The conversation that needs to happen is not, what facility can we find that is safe and adequately staffed and has a nice garden in the photographs? The conversation that needs to happen is, What does this person still have to give? And who in the world needs exactly that? Because this is what gets left out of every brochure, every colored folder, every well-intentioned Tuesday conversation with a table between you. Old people, women especially, women who spent 50 years as the invisible infrastructure of families and communities, don't just need care, they have it to give. They are reservoirs of it. They have patience that was forged in circumstances you would not survive. They have knowledge of the specific and the practical and the human that doesn't exist in any manual. They have time, which is actually rarer than it sounds, and the ability to be present in it. What Blythe needed was not a grandmother, not a program, not an enrichment activity. She needed someone who looked at her drawings the way you look at something that matters. I happened to be available. I happened to have been, once, someone who could tell the difference between work that is only technically correct and work that has something true in it. What Soren needed was not a mentor or a community resource. He needed someone who knew how the boiler valve worked and who made shortbread and who had been through hard things and was still standing in them and had come to understand that you could be diminished by circumstances without being diminished as a person. What I needed was to still be a person, not a resident, not a risk factor, not a box that Priscilla had to check. A person in a house that smells of old books and quince preserves and 43 years of being lived in, who opens her door in the morning not knowing entirely what the day will bring, which is all any of us ever really have, and all any of us ever really need. The radiator works now. Blythe drew a picture of it for reasons best known to herself and gave it to me in a frame. It hangs in the kitchen. I still shake when I pour tea. I still wake at 3 a.m. sometimes and lie there remembering Renford in fragments. His hands, the specific way he laughed at his own jokes, the weight of him in the bed. I still have mornings when the house feels very large and very quiet in ways that have no remedy. But on Saturday mornings, there are footsteps on the path, and a small, serious face appears at the kitchen window before the knock, because she knows I'm always up, and there is something to show me, or something to ask, or sometimes just the uncomplicated fact of being somewhere she has decided to be. And I open the door. That's the whole of it, really. That is what I learned after 2 years and a color-coded folder and a very cold winter and a woman named Venetia who moved my cup. You do not solve loneliness by building structures around it. You solve it by opening the door. The answer was already on the street. It has always been on the street, in every street, in every town where old people sit alone in houses growing cold, and young people sit alone in houses growing desperate. And no one has yet knocked on the wrong door at the right moment and said, in effect, "Here I am. Do you have a moment? Can you help me? Can I help you? Shall we? Shall we? Yes, I think we shall."